and Planning Committee of the RTD will now come to order. We are convened as of 5:30 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. I would respectfully ask everyone who's attending this meeting to mute yourself, please, unless and until you are recognized by the chair to speak. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. Please note that the committee meetings of the RTD Board of Directors will continue for a period of time to be held remotely via Zoom. Now, these meetings will be audio and video recorded, and the meeting recordings, along with the unofficial minutes of these meetings, will be posted as soon as practicable on the board's website. Visit rtd-denver.com to access these. And in addition, a live stream of this meeting is also available via RTD's YouTube page. Now, directors and members of the staff, for the sake of the record, if you would please like to be acknowledged during tonight's proceedings, I would ask you please to raise your virtual hand and wait for me to call upon you before proceeding to speak. Directors and staff who are participating by phone can also raise their virtual hands to indicate that they would like to speak by pressing *9 on your phone. And to toggle your mute setting on the phone, please press *6. So I would now like to call the roll for the committee members. Director Peggy Kaplan.
Here.
Director Bobby Deshelle is excused from the meeting and will be absent. Chair Lynn Geisinger.
I'm here.
Director Michael Guzman.
I am present.
And Director Ian Harwick.
Here.
And Committee Vice Chair Eric Davidson.
Here.
And I am Chair Doug Tisdale, and I am present. I am not seeing, and I think that's because of the way I have my screen set up, the other board members, but I do see now Director Marjorie Sloan is with us, and Director Troy Whitmore is with us. Are there any other board directors who are with us whom I have not recognized? All right, so we have those two, and we thank you for that. I will now open the public comment portion of our meeting. This is an opportunity for anyone who would like to address the committee regarding any topic that is listed in the published meeting agenda, either for this current meeting that we're having now, and also for the immediately preceding month. If you wish to speak, and if you've not already done this, please now either raise your virtual hand or press *9 on your phone so that we will know you wish to speak. Now, please note, during this time, the committee will not offer any direct comments or responses to anything that you say. If you would like to be contacted personally regarding your public comment, please simply email the board office at rtd.boardoffice@rtd-denver.com. So now, may I ask of staff, are there any hands raised at this time?
No, there are no hands raised.
All right, then I can forego the description of how we process these comments and even avoid my advance. Please do not feel that you are compelled to use the full 3 minutes that you're accorded during this public comment period. Having now confirmed with staff that no hands are raised, I will let you know that board office staff has also advised me that we have not received any emailed comments for today's meeting. And so therefore, with no participants in the queue and no email comments received, we will close the public comment period at this time. Next is our information from external entities. There is one external entity report on the agenda this evening. That report is for the sales and use tax forecast. Now, for the sake of the record, these materials can be found at committee packet page 3 through page 77. I would like to ask Doug McLeod, our Chief Financial Officer, if he would now introduce this item, and also please introduce our distinguished advisors from the CU Leeds School of Business. Mr. McLeod, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good evening. As the chair mentioned, we do have a discussion item or an external party presentation from the CU Leeds School of Business. Joining me tonight are Rich Wobekind, Robert McNown, and Brian Lewandowski, who will have a presentation momentarily. Also in the packet is included the August 2023 sales and use tax forecast, the most recent forecast. The entire report is in there too, for your reference. Before we jump in, I just want to refer to a couple of items that are stated in the board report itself. The last forecast, the previous forecast received by RTD from the Leeds School of Business was in March of 2023. The most recent forecast being the one received in August of this year. Just for your information, there's a table in that board report that points out the changes between those two forecasts. We use here at RTD, we use those forecasts for both our budget as well as our midterm financial plan. So within comparing the two forecasts, the most recent forecast actually shows a decrease in sales and use tax projected collections for 2023 for the year of $21.5 million, which is a 2.4% decrease. That's really based on our recent experience. The last 4 months have been relatively flat compared to the prior year, so we're not seeing the historical growth that we've seen over the last few years, at least over the last 4 months. So I think that tempered some expectations in the remainder of this year in terms of sales tax collections. And then for the full 6-year period for the midterm financial plan, the forecast has decreased with the August presentation by $19.4 million. So $21.5 million for 1 year, $19.4 million for 6 years. So obviously there's some years that actually show increases as you get further into the 6-year period. So Mr. Chair, without further ado, I would like to turn the floor over to Mr. Wobekind to lead the presentation.
Hopefully you're seeing the slides.
We are indeed, Rich. Thank you very much, sir.
Okay, so we're ready to roll. Well, thank you so much, Doug, for the introduction. And yes, I'm Rich Wobekind, and joining me tonight in the presentation is Dr. McNown, our lead econometrician on these modeling projects. And also, as mentioned, our team leader, Brian Lewandowski, is on the call and will be taking questions at the end as needed as we go through. You also see in the slide our other team members, Miles Light and Adam Illig, who work at the Business Research Division. I would highlight and repeat what you just heard. So this was an August 2023 report. And again, more for newer members of the board, even though it's been a year now, for probably almost a year for everyone. We do this twice a year and typically roughly 6 months apart to fit into RTD's budget and forecasting cycle for future budgetary sources and uses, if you will. So this is the second time this year we have presented. And as mentioned, this is updated and does show a change, and you'll hear more about that in the second part of the presentation from my colleague, Dr. McNown. So when looking at the sales and use tax forecast, we always talk about what's going on in the background. And when you look at this particular slide, you come away with a couple of pieces, that are clear. there's been a lot of uncertainty in the forecast, and that has been shown in the actual reports that we've given you. The error bands are pretty wide around the forecast. A lot of these things continue to be questionable or unknown. When we have been entered the year, we were not forecasting a recession, but we were forecasting a very slow economy. And the economy has clearly outperformed. The first 3 quarters have all been over 2% GDP growth. So that's on sort of the positive side. But on the flip side, if I showed you this graph that, this slide that we showed you a year ago, you would see a lot more of these arrows in green, far fewer in red than you see on this particular one. So even though the economy has outperformed, the mixture of the red and yellow arrows on this particular graphic still give people concerns, and we see this reflected in confidence surveys and other things by both businesses and consumers, that they're still worried that there's potential for a recession in next year, and we're not out of the woods yet. That kind of a background piece. So that, of course, creates a lot of uncertainty. And just to tie it to something that Doug mentioned, the retail sales that you'll be tied to as we go through this, we're focused a lot on the consumer in this overall picture, because the consumer, of course, is a huge percentage of GDP, but the consumer is also driving the retail sales environment. So pay a lot of attention to that obviously in the modeling, but just in general in terms of looking at the overall macro economy. So a little bit more about that as we go along. So again, GDP has outperformed through the first 2 quarters and the beginning of, and so far in the 3rd quarter, it officially ended on Friday, but most of the forecasts for the 3rd quarter are suggesting it's going to be over 2% for Q3 of 2023. Going forward, again, when we look at the Moody's Analytics and the consensus forecast outlooks for 2023 and 2024 in particular, you can see the 2024 forecasts from both Moody's and from consensus forecasts are much slower growth than this year. This year at 2% and next year at sub 2% kind of growth. So looking at another year of relatively weak growth overall in the economy. Of course, underlying some of this is our prices in the economy, and the Fed, I believe, at least a lot of the commentary seems to flit around. They feel like they're winning the battle in terms of controlling inflation in the economy, but they do think the 2% number that is their target is a somewhat elusive goal. All of that kind of behind the scenes signals that it's unlikely we're going to see much change in interest rates, particularly in the downward direction, anywhere in the near future. So you can see the consumer price index. This is national at the moment on the left-hand side. And one of the things that's been encouraging is the producer price index used to be referred to as the wholesale price index, but the inputs, if you will, in the production process had really come down dramatically. More recently, we're seeing that those inputs turn up as well, still in a very modest way and still at a very good level year over year, but not going to be able to continue to extract any gains, if you will, from lower producer prices. And as you know, and it got tons of airplay, the Denver Aurora Lakewood MSA has been one of the higher inflation areas in the country. Again, as a primer, I guess, for understanding the CPI, if you care to, you can see that a few components, the weights are in the far right-hand column, and there are just a couple of components that really combined come up to about 80% of the overall index, those being food and beverages, housing, and transportation. So you could see those pieces together, again, 75% better than 75% of the overall index when we add those pieces together. So when we look at that, how are we doing in those areas, and what our expectations could be about those areas, and frankly, the housing component, which is measured by a formula for cost of shelter, continues to plague the Denver, Aurora, Lakewood MSA, at least through the July numbers, which are the most recent. July for Denver, Aurora, Lakewood, August for the overall index. If that's confusing, I apologize. Denver, Aurora, Lakewood's only done every other month, so that's why we're sort of a month behind there. We always like to look at the metrics of Colorado versus other states that are out there, and you can see the other states that are out there, how we are ranking and how we feel. And, a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago, we were in the top 10 to 20 in most of these. We have, in this past year, have dropped into a rank that's somewhere more in the middle of the pack for most of these. But doing certainly better than average has been per capita personal income is certainly top 10 in the country. Average annual pay 7th in the country on average, so those are particularly strong numbers. Labor force participation, also a very strong number with 4th highest labor force participation rate. We do see a slowing in the home price index growth for both 1 year and quarterly. In terms of our rankings, we went out of the top 20 down into the 30s and 40s. Probably a good sign in terms of overall affordability of housing in Colorado, but it really hasn't been reflected in terms of the rents and other things, at least to this point in time. Surprising maybe to some, but the population growth continues to be slower than it had been. We were always a top 10 kind of population growth state, and now we're at 19th in terms of population growth. So that particularly has gotten a lot of sort of focus. One quick comment here before, and I'll try to move this along or speed this up just a little bit, but employment growth, our rank dropped all the way down to 32nd and has gotten a lot of attention in the newspapers and in broadcast media, print and broadcast media. And there's been a lot of discussion about, is the luster off, or one of the quote of comments that we have made in our reports is that we think it may be a combination of a labor supply shortage, but it also could be possibly a reflection of maybe miscounting. We've heard from the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment that this may be getting underreported. So we don't really have a sort of a firm grip on this. Well, the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment has come out with some suggested revisions, employment revisions, based on what they think may be inaccuracies on how some of these numbers, the basing point of some of these numbers, monthly numbers. And if you put those revisions in, it does put Colorado back up into the top 10 or 15 employment growth states. So that's an encouraging sign. If in fact all of this comes to fruition, after everything gets re-benchmarked every quarter, the economic data gets re-benchmarked. Happy to explain that in more detail in Q&A if people are interested. We do seem to continue to have an acute labor force shortage, and the data that just came out this morning, that updated in this particular slide, we're now at 1.9 to 1. 1.9 available jobs for every one job, every one unemployed person. It was 2.1 in the previous month, so it has come down ever so slightly, but it is still a bigger or larger gap than the nation as a whole. So it does appear to be a labor force shortage issue to some extent in terms of available labor to fill the jobs that are out there. We have seen, consistent again with Mr. McLeod comments in the introduction, we have seen a slowing of national retail sales year over year, 2.5%, and 0.6% month over month. And the tan line on this graphic is Colorado, and you can see Colorado tamping even a little bit more over the last couple of months. So that's very consistent with what we're seeing in your data, in the RTD data that we're working with. We're seeing this sort of dampening of retail sales. You know, some of it's a lower inflation rate environment, but some of it may be the consumer actually slowing down a little bit. And that's why we pay so much attention to the consumer in this environment. There are lots of studies that are looking at the fact that a lot of the excess savings which accrued over the COVID recovery period have been burned down. There are some additional concerns being expressed with student loan repayments starting this particular month, which will affect individuals, a segment of the population, $200 to $300 a month on average. So some of those things could continue to damp retail sales as we go forward. That's at least what people are looking at, you know, in terms of things people are thinking about. And we have a wide variety of tailwinds, headwinds, and unknowns. I spend a little bit more time on the headwinds just for a moment. The ones hopefully in the left-hand side would be somewhat obvious. The job openings, consumers still continuing to spend. Obviously, the employment growth, which has been very positive. Income growth, again, we got very good income growth numbers just today, actually. So we're continuing to see very good signs in terms of the fundamentals of the economy in terms of moving forward. But there's just this number of headwinds that are out there. Financial, which I'm happy to talk about in more detail. Commercial real estate, the government shutdown, now that's been averted for, as of yesterday and today, but it's still we're facing that again in 45 days. The continuing challenges of climate change, worker shortages, worker patterns, and so on. You can sort of see the other things we have in our sort of headwinds category and our unknowns category. So just to highlight three of these quickly before passing the baton to my colleague. So one of them, and they overlap. So, but I think these are important things to keep sort of in the back of our mind as we're looking. So one of them is the future of work in terms of central business districts, office vacancies, what that means in terms of multiplier effects of people spending, sort of the downtown vibrancy, and so on. You can see that, and potentially commercial defaults, which bleeds into the financial expectations that I mentioned a little bit earlier. But this is from 2020. The 2019 data is very similar. We don't have any updated data from here, but this, for example, is the inflow and the outflow of commuters to the Denver metro area, to Denver specifically, the city and county of Denver. This is county-based data. Brian can correct me in the Q&A, but this county-based data, so city and county of Denver. And you can see the city and county in Denver is certainly getting a lot more inflow than it has outflow. So these are the people coming into work. These are the people going out to work, 180,000. And the 150,000 are the people who live and work in the county. So you could sort of see why we're paying, a lot of attention to this if that pattern changes. Certainly bank deposits had gone through a significant decline. You can see this now. I don't know if you get the full box up in the right-hand corner. This is most recently ticked up a little bit, but this, of course, is an area of concern. And in terms of banks having enough money for lending and whether they pull back on lending. And that, of course, impacts far more than the commercial real estate market. It affects small businesses. It affects consumers. And so we're paying a lot of attention to that, and you can't sort of ignore that it's out there, that it's part of the issue. And then again, I said there's a lot of overlap here in terms of these three things, but the higher interest rates in the economy certainly putting a lot of pressure on the banking system, but putting a lot of pressure on other sources of, venture capital flows and other sources of capital. When you can get a 5% rate of return that's essentially risk-free at this moment, and someone else is saying it's a difficult investment environment, I may be able to get you 8% or whatever. There's a lot less interest on the part of money to flow to those types of investments. So it just makes it more difficult to get a lot of sort of the creation of, or money for high growth ventures or the creation of new businesses. So with that, I'm passing the baton to my colleague, Dr. McNown, to talk about the RTD forecast and the drivers of that forecast.
Yes, thanks, Rich. Happy to be here to present and discuss our forecasts with the board. So just a quick overview. The core of our economic forecasting project and the forecasts of RTD sales and use tax revenues is a model of the Colorado economy. And clearly the Colorado economy is influenced by what's going on at the national level, although with some degree of independence. And I think that's indicated by some of the slides that Rich presented. So you have an overview of sort of the current situation at the national level. And this is summarized in the table here. The forecasts at the national level come from Moody's, and we're emphasizing Moody's baseline scenario, which they and we also have determined is the most likely outcome. We also present forecasts with alternative scenarios, but we'll focus on the baseline to begin with. And so you can see, just focusing on 2023, there's going to be a lot of numbers here, and I'll only point to a few of them. But obviously, what's happening with retail sales is really crucial, a crucial driver of sales tax revenues. And although we're going to be particularly interested in the change, the rate of growth of retail sales for Colorado, but you'll see it's quite similar to what's being projected here for the rest of this year, and then even a little weaker in 2024 at the national level anyway. And it's important for me to point out that even though the growth in retail sales is positive, it still falls far short of the increase in costs as indicated by the rate of inflation here. So in real terms, retail sales are falling behind. Let's go on to the next slide. So the focus then here is on the Colorado economy, key macroeconomic indicators here. And you see a similar picture that, say, compared to 2022 and 2021, where we had really robust growth in retail sales for the state of Colorado. For the current year, we're down around 3%, far below this higher rate of inflation that we experience here in the Front Range. And that's something you saw on one of Rich's slides as well, that our rate of inflation tends to be about 1 percentage point higher than it is at the national level. And a little bit different here from the national economy is that our model is forecasting a slightly better picture for retail sales in 2024. So let's go on to the next slide as well. And this is, of course, the heart of our forecast. Some of the historical data going back to 2020, but also for the current year, 2023, and then to our final medium-term forecast horizon in 2029. And of course, the tall part of the bars here, the tan part, represents sales tax revenues. And once again, similar to what we saw for retail sales, we see there's a really strong growth in the previous 2 years, 2021, 2022, double-digit growth in sales and use tax revenues. But now what's projected for 2023 is really extremely modest. Keep in mind, it is still a positive rate of growth. However, it's not as strong as what was projected back in March. And I think that's a point that Doug was making as well. But there's quite a strong bounce back that's expected for 2024. And I think that reflects a slightly stronger picture that we saw for some of the key economic indicators for the state in the previous slide. So let's go on to the next slide as well. So we provide the short-term forecasts for 2023, 2024. The model also projects out to 2029, following a planning horizon that RTD uses. And so here's what our forecasts have looked like over the past several vintages when we've presented these semi-annual updates. And let's focus on these top two lines. So first of all, we see this black line, and this was the fairly strong, steady growth that was projected back in March for ITD revenues. And the blue line is the current forecast that we're making now. And you can see that it's much weaker into 2023, but then converges back to the level or the trend level that was predicted back in March. So it just seems to be a temporary shortfall with a strong recovery back to our previous level, or back to the level that was forecast in the previous update in March. In any case, both of these forecasts that we've generated in this year are stronger over this entire forecast horizon than what we saw a year ago. And that's, of course, reflecting the really strong recovery that we've experienced in 2022. And the next slide. So it's important to emphasize the uncertainty that's involved in any forecasting project. There are a couple of ways we do this. The dashed lines that are labeled high forecast and low forecast are statistically based confidence bounds, such that the probability that the actual revenues collected in any one year falls outside these confidence bounds, either above the high or below the low, that probability is only about 33%. So I think it gives you a good range of the possible outcomes. Another way of incorporating the uncertainty is to consider alternative scenarios coming from Moody's. And so Moody's, I've emphasized previously, mostly this baseline forecast. Moody's presents a number of alternative forecasts, and we've selected for further information an optimistic scenario, which is just a little bit stronger than what the baseline says. The pessimistic one, however, has a real notable recession here going into 2024, but then a recovery, although it takes a long time to move back to a previous level, and in fact never quite moves back to that baseline projection even by 2029. So if a significant recession does come to pass in 2024, that's incorporated in the revenue forecast for RTD, indicated by this red line. Well, we hope that doesn't happen, but of course, it certainly is possible. And the next slide. So we're also charged with developing forecasts that go out to 2050. And the basis for our model forecasting out that far is that we emphasize particularly demographic change, that we're fairly confident in predicting or using the census forecasts and predicting what's happening in terms of the aging of our population, as well as the decreased growth in overall population. And that strongly influences economic activity in a variety of ways. And so what we see here in the forecast, and we can focus on the blue line, is the sort of the medium or or baseline forecasts that we're generating here is that there's considerable variation over time. It's not like a straight line projection by any means. And that reflects the variation in demographic change that's likely to occur over the next about 30 years. So what we see here is that in the current decade, in this second row here, we've got fairly strong growth in RTD taxable sales and therefore sales tax revenues. And we've already seen that materialize in particularly what we observed in 2021 and 2022. And even if it continues at a modest level, we're still going to achieve an average rate of growth of retail sales or taxable sales of over 6%. But now that falls off dramatically in the following decades because of the demographic changes that we're very confident are going to occur. So that the average rate of growth annually over this entire forecast period is only about 3.33%. And the next slide. So I do want to emphasize some aspects of our forecasting methodology. We rely on an econometric model. We don't introduce judgmental adjustments such as add factors to the model forecast. We think that the best information that we can provide to the board, to RTD and the staff is through careful consideration of the model, that it follows the best available econometric methodologies, and also the most recent data. So when we do our forecasts every 6 months, we bring in the most recent data. And I should also emphasize that we don't have any particular political or financial interest in what comes out in terms of the forecast numbers. Of course, we do want them to be as accurate as possible. So thanks for your attention, and we'll be happy to take some questions. So go to the last slide.
Thank you very much, Dr. McNown and Rich Wobbekind for an, as always, stellar and informative presentation. Now I'm going to ask if there are any comments or questions from the committee or from other directors. And let me point out that we will not be repeating this presentation at the full board meeting later this month. Therefore, tonight is the only opportunity that you will have to ask our distinguished visitors from the CU Leeds School of Business any questions about this forecast. So with that, I will now open up the floor to members of the committee and to directors. And let me ask, Rich, if you would be so kind, maybe if you can stop screen sharing for right now, just so we can see people, and then we may come back. But if you would like to speak, please raise your virtual hand on the Zoom app or press *9 on your phone to indicate to staff that you would like to speak. So I'll pause and give you an opportunity to do that. And I'll go first to Vice Chair Davidson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Gentlemen, always good to see you. Thank you for coming and as always, presenting a look. Just more a comment, less a question here. I think the gap that we see between the low or the pessimistic scenario and the baseline that's in the near term in the 2024 represents where the uncertainty lies. And I think I'm just stating the obvious for directors here, but once again, that's timed right around our Tabor exemption on the base system. So something we'll be talking about more later, but we've been talking about that hypothetical for a while, and boy, does it stick out seeing that gap. And as you said, Dr. McNown, hopefully that doesn't come to pass, but given that that's where the uncertainty is, something this body needs to think about. So thank you very much for being here. Great presentation as always.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. And I should point out too, for everyone, recall that beginning at packet page 26, there's a great deal of additional information that the CU lead school has given us relative to this forecast model and a much more in-depth analysis than they could accomplish during the PowerPoint presentation. Madam Chair, Lynn Geisinger, you are now recognized.
Thank you very much, and thank all of you for this presentation. It's always helpful. I was in a little conversation on this with Doug McLeod today, and it's sort of a follow-up from Eric's question that if we become subject to Tabor, and there is a moving down the pessimistic version, do you have a number that you use for the property value as you're projecting forward?
Dr. McNown, if you'd care to respond to that.
I'm sorry, Director. I'm not sure I understand.
Yeah, I'm sorry, maybe I
the
didn't say
question
that.
in terms of you referred to the property values, or
If we become subject to Tabor, it's measured by the annual, Doug might have to help me, the gain in property values. I think it's appraised values is what they use. And that's what we would have to start factoring in. And in fact, I think our team has factored it in. And I was just curious if you've looked at that at all, what appraised values over the course of time would look like.
Well, I have to say, no, we have not. Now, in other forecasting projects that we do for other municipalities in the area, we do forecast property taxes, which of course require forecast of appraised and imputed values. And that's certainly well within our purview and expertise. But since that's not been something we've been tasked with so far, I really can't give you a good answer on that.
Okay, thanks very much. I think our consultants in the Reimagine project did come up with some numbers, so I'm not asking you to do it. I just was curious what your numbers might look like. Thanks.
In short, as I understand it, they have the capacity and the expertise, but it's not in their brief. And so that's why they have not performed that analysis for us, but we could certainly ask for that in the future, should that be desired. Are there other comments from any members of the committee or any other directors who are in this meeting tonight relative to the CU Lead School of Business forecast that we have received? He paused, giving people a chance to unmute. Director Guzman.
So I have one, and maybe this is just me being pessimistic, but why are we using the baseline model instead of the more pessimistic line to be more conservative in our forward thinking about budgeting? And just general would be fine. I just don't understand why we wouldn't look at it in a more conservative manner. What would be the kick in the pants I need to understand why we're looking at a higher amount when there's so much uncertainty? Thank you.
Thank you, Director.
Yeah.
Dr. McDowell.
That's a perfectly reasonable question. And in fact, one of the reasons that we provide these alternative scenarios and the forecast based on them is to give you, the board, the staff, the opportunity to consider the more pessimistic possibility. And I think your question is very well placed. We like to think that our task is to provide these alternatives with some basis for why we think the baseline scenario is the most likely, but of course there's a reasonable probability that a more pessimistic outcome could materialize. And so I think it would be entirely reasonable if the board were to decide that possibly the pessimistic scenario, or maybe even a midpoint between the pessimistic and the baseline scenario, which might be appropriate for your planning purposes. I don't know if Brian or Rich want to.
Well,
enter
I
into
was
the
just going to
discussion.
highlight that the pessimistic scenario is in the error band of, it's in the high-low error band for the baseline forecast. And so, and I would certainly argue exactly what you just said, Robert, that you should be thinking about, you can be on the lower side of that error band if you think the uncertainty is uncomfortable. Oh, Brian and I were talking about this afternoon, and I don't want to go off on a side rail here, but just really quickly, we track how many times the forecast is high and how many times the forecast is low. And over the last couple of years, it's been high. You've come in higher than the forecast. In the last 2 years, we've had these really high retail sales numbers, but for a long period of time prior to that, we would be over one quarter, we would be below the next quarter. It would really fluctuate up and down like I would argue a good forecast should, that you're getting in and out and around that band. So, I think your question, Commissioner Guzman, is super valid, and that's something that the group has to think about.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Rich. Brian Lewandowski, did you want to weigh in on that too? Your name was used a couple times there.
No, I guess the only thing I would share is following on Rich's comment. When we take a look back at the entire history of doing this with RTD, for the last 13 years or 14 years or so, we've had a tendency to be a little bit low, about 55% of the time, and a little bit high in our estimate, 45% of the time. So I think that's a pretty good judge of our record over time. We do scrutinize the Moody's scenarios with every update and decide what we think is the appropriate base model to use. And sometimes that happens to be the Moody's actual baseline that they're publishing. And then sometimes we choose a different scenario because we're trying to discern what we think the most likely path of the economy is. And as we were going through that exercise for this update, we did select the Moody's baseline scenario because it does seem very plausible.
And thank you for repeating, for the benefit of directors who have not heard you say that before, which is a question I have asked in the past. How often have you been right and how often have you been wrong? And to say that 55% of the time your forecasts are just a little below what we have, and 45% of the time they're a little higher than what we have received. And I think our CFO, Mr. McLeod, wants to weigh in on this too. So Doug, you are recognized.
Thank you. Yeah, and just add a little bit more context. The forecast that was provided by these gentlemen, CU Leeds School of Business, is a forecast that it's up to RTD to choose which scenario is to be used in our planning and budgeting. And as Mr. Lewandowski indicated, the medium forecast historically has been the one that's very close to what our actual experience is. And statistically speaking, it's the highest probability in terms of what's likely to happen. I believe the optimistic and the pessimistic forecasts are around the range of 33% likely, where I think it's somewhere around 67, 70% likely that the medium forecast. So statistically speaking, it's more valid to use that forecast. Now we could do something lower, and we actually have forecasted a little bit lower, and I'll talk about that a little bit during the MTFP because of the Tabor challenges that we have. So I guess it's all to say that this is great information. These gentlemen are expertise. We tend to take experts in their area. We tend to take some liberties with some adjustments within our planning process based on internal factors. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. McLeod. We appreciate that. Director Catlin, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And you and Director Whitmore may recall 4 or 5 years ago when we had considerable debate about some of these forecasts, and we had some angst about taking the baseline, and I believe we did not adopt a midterm financial plan because we were nervous about the forecasts. And so to Director Guzman's comments, we do have the ability to adopt something that's a little more conservative to give us a little bit of comfort. But I just remember those 4 years ago or whatever, we were very, very nervous about the projections and kind of punted when we did not pass a midterm financial plan that year because we wanted to wait and see. So I'm just augmenting what Doug McLeod and our experts have said, but we did have that period of time where we were ultra cautious, I guess.
Thank you for sharing that, Director Catlin. That's right, and I recall that well. And I know Director Whitmore does also.
Thank you
Other-
for answering those questions. I really do appreciate it. I know that it's coming from a place of super curiosity, and I'm not an expert in finance at all, so I rely on this information, but I've read through it thoroughly and it just boggled me. I'm like, what are we doing and how do we do this? So, as you know, I hate to say it, but you know, this is only the second time I've experienced one of these reports, and I am grateful for them. So thank you for your expertise and for your guidance.
Your questions are always welcome, Director Guzman. It's important to have everyone make sure that they leave this meeting feeling satisfied relative to the information provided. As I said, we will not have this presentation at the full board meeting. This is our shot. So we develop as complete a record as we can, so the directors who have not had the opportunity to participate in this meeting may at least watch the video or read the transcript and have an opportunity to understand what this particular forecast means to us. Last call for any further comments or questions regarding the projections and forecast received from the CU Leeds School of Business and Professor Dean Richard Wobekant and Dr. Robert McNown, and Brian Lewandowski. Any further comments or questions? Hearing none, we'll close out our discussion on that. Gentlemen from CU, thank you very much. Go Buffs, and good luck next week.
Thank you.
All right. We turn now to recommended actions. There are 4 recommended actions on the agenda this evening. The first action is for the 3rd amendment to the RTD salaried defined contribution plan. Now, for the board of directors, the recommended action is for the board of directors to approve a 3rd amendment to the salaried employees defined contribution plan to change the vesting schedule to 20% vesting at 1 year of employment and an additional 20% at each year of employment thereafter, with 100% vesting at 5 years. Now, for the sake of the record, the materials for this recommended action are found at the committee packet page 71 through 78 through page 81. Do we have a motion?
So moved.
And a second to that motion?
Second.
I have Director Catlin as the movant and Director Harwick as the second. And I would now like to ask Doug McLeod, our Chief Financial Officer, to present on this item. Ms. McLeod, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Tisdale. Just a little bit of additional background about this requested action item. So as we've mentioned, this is a defined contribution plan for our salaried or non-represented employees. These are employees that were hired on January 1st, 2008 and thereafter. Not salaried or non-represented employees hired prior to that point participate in the defined benefit pension plan. So with this plan, RTD contributes 9% of wages for each salaried employee hired after January 1st, 2008. The employee does not contribute any of their funds, but has another alternative in a 457B plan. However, with this defined contribution plan, it contains a cliff vesting, which means that there's no vesting that happens for each employee until they reach their 5th year anniversary. So if an employee were to terminate prior to their 5th year of employment, they would not be able to keep any of that money that RTD has contributed because they're 0% vested. So that money would be forfeited back into the plan. What's being proposed here is to change that vesting schedule. So each, as Chair Tisdale described, each successive year of employment, the employee would earn another 20% ownership within those contributions. So year 1, they'd own 20% of the contributions, year 2, 40%, and so on, still getting to 100% at 5 years, but it's ratably over the 5 years instead of a cliff at the 5-year point. The reason this recommendation is coming forth, and by the way, it's a recommendation from the trustees of that plan, including unanimous recommendation, including directors Deschel and directors Broom that serve on that trustee, on that trust. The reason is to bring parity with this between this plan and the vesting schedule on the new plan, defined contribution plan that was open for represented employees with a collective bargaining agreement that the board approved. So really, it's a parity issue to bring parity between the two plans, to not have two different vesting schedules amongst different groups of employees, as well as to enhance the competitiveness in terms of retaining and attracting employees. We feel it's much more market competitive to offer something that's closer to what the private sector offers. Mr. Chair, with committee approval and board approval this month, the changes would take place. There's some coding that needs to take place with Empower, the contracted firm that takes care of this plan, that would not occur until February 1st. With board approval during this month, that would give Empower the time to actually implement these changes, which would be in effect on February 1st. And they would apply to all of those employees participating in this plan. So if I'm at my 3-year anniversary, by February 4th, I automatically go from 0% vested up to 60%. So it would apply across the board. I think I've covered all the salient points, Mr. Chair, and would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. McLeod. At this time, I will ask those directors who have questions or who wish to speak to raise your virtual hands, and I'll call on you in turn. Remember, for directors or staff calling into the meeting, if you wish to speak, please press *9. And before recognizing directors, let me just highlight that the intent of the plan amendment is to create parity and equity among our workforce, treating our salaried employees the same way that we treat our represented employees. And that is the central focus of this recommended action. And speaking of workforce, I should note for the record that Charlene Polegi, our Chief People Officer, is also on that committee that unanimously recommended this. I see a number of directors, but I see General Counsel, and as a lawyer, I will defer to General Counsel first to ask a question or raise a comment that she may have. So, General Counsel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is Melanie Snyder, General Counsel. I just wanted to highlight, it looks like a couple edits that I had made on the third amendment that are in the board packet on pages 80 and 81. Those didn't get entered into the packet, unfortunately. So it's just the effective date that CFO McLeod just noted. It's February 1st, 2024. There's a few dates that still say January 1st, 2024. So I will work with board staff to ensure that we get that attachment swapped out, and we'll get those records updated accordingly.
Thank you very much for that. And the chair will note that that is a mere ministerial administrative change that can be made to the document and does not impact the motion requiring any kind of amendment. Thank you for alerting us to that.
You're welcome.
Madam Vice Chair Catlin, Board Vice Chair Catlin, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe Mr. McLeod can answer this for me, but I believe when I was reading through the packet, it said that there would be no fiscal impact. But then again, it said that the forfeited funds as it stands currently could not be used for benefits. But they were used for administrative funds. So this is effectively going to change some of the administrative administrative funds that we have available to the agency. Am I correct?
Yes,
Mr.
thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, great question. So currently, and thank you for serving on the trust previously, Director Catlin. As you know, the contributions that go into the plan cannot be returned to the employer if they're forfeited, right? So they, per IRS rules, those funds have to stay within the plan. And as you mentioned, they're used for administrative expenses. Those forfeitures have grown to over, last time I heard a few months ago, is $680,000 in forfeitures. More than enough to pay administrative expenses. And we also took a look at, hey, if we change this vesting schedule, the forfeiture would probably be less from people who leave and take some of their leave before 5 years and take some of their RTD's contributions with them and not leave them in the plan to pay administrative expenses. But based on our look at it, we think there's plenty of money, so there won't be a fiscal impact to RTD having to backfill that loss of any funds that are taking out, just because there's such a big chunk of money in there already. So hopefully that answered your question.
You anticipated my second question, which is what's that amount that's sitting in reserve? But the other thing is that with respect to the chair's comment, there is still not parity in terms of the agency's contributions to the different plans, represented versus non-represented. And I mean, they are different percentages. And so I just want to just state for the record that they are not all exactly the same. And this board has taken action for certain percentages or certain amounts to be contributed to increase the solvency of those plans. So I was just stating that for the record. Thank you.
That is an excellent amplification and clarification. Yes, parity relating to the vesting rights, not specifically as to contributions. Thank you. Yes, I appreciate that. Director Guzman, you are recognized, sir.
Thank you. I want to make sure I understood something clearly, and that is that once this becomes effective February 1st of 2024, this is retroactive to the employees that were hired after January 1st of 2008. Did I hear that correctly? So that it is the 20% is going to accrue for people who have worked already. And I just want to make sure that I'm clear on that, because I was not under that impression reading the paragraph on page 79 right above financial impact. Made it sound like that was only going to begin on February 1st of 2024. Just getting clarification. I'm excited if the answer is yes, that's correct. So.
Mr. McLeod, you may feel free to excite Director Guzman.
Thank you. Yeah, correct. You're absolutely right. And yeah, it was difficult to phrase that correctly. I'm not sure retroactive is a good term because one of the things is we didn't want to give the indication that somebody who's already left would with board approval that this would automatically entitle them to forfeited contributions. Recognizing that the coding can't be completed until February 1st, that would be the date that it's effective, but it would be unfair for an employee to be here versus somebody new to vest on a different schedule or not recognize their years of service and reward them accordingly. And it has been frankly a pain point with several employees. It's been brought up with the dialogue with Deborah on a few occasions as well. So I think it's a very good thing for our current employees that recognizes their contributions, and I think it'll be very well received.
Thank you for clarifying. It's the word that I would have used, but you explained why. That's what I was trying to get to. So thank you.
Thank you, Director Guzman. Director Whitmore, you are recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. While not quite as excited as Director Guzman, I am pleased with that answer, Mr. CFO. Not so much with my colleagues on the board and certainly not with staff, but it seems like in the public, when we talk about people power, we dwell on recruitment. And when we looked at numbers last night with Ms. Pileggi's report, retention is critical. And that seems like such an important priority on the people power front. So to have this parity brought into the right focus, at least on the vesting rights, I think is a very smart move. So I certainly appreciate the trustees bringing this forward and the discussion and the clarity and us understanding what hopefully we can do to improve situations for retention, because it is so important. So not being as a member of the committee, I still would like to urge a yes vote, Mr. Chair. And with that, I'll go back to silent.
Thank you very much, Director Whitmore. Always happy to hear your voice. Any other comments or questions from committee members or other directors present at this meeting? Hearing none, thank you all for the discussion. Therefore, on the recommended action as moved by Director Kaplan and seconded by Director Harwick, are there any no votes on this recommended action? Hearing none, then the record will reflect that there is a unanimous vote of support from this committee. Absent Director Deschel, who is absent from the meeting, and it will proceed to the consent agenda for the full board meeting. The second action for this evening is the 2024 investment policy. It reads, for the Board of Directors to approve the 2024 investment policy. For the sake of the record, materials for this recommended action are found at committee packet page 82 through page 107. Do we have a motion?
So moved.
And is there
Second.
a second? And
Second, Davidson.
Davidson. All right. So I have Chair Geisinger as the movant and the Vice Chair of the committee, Eric Davidson, as the second. And we will now proceed to discussion. I would like to ask once again, Doug McLeod, our Chief Financial Officer, and Brendan Morgan, our Senior Manager of Debt and Investments, to present this item. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Just briefly, a little bit more information about this item. We like to bring the investment policy once a year, at least once a year, to the Finance and Planning Committee and also to the board to approve it for the upcoming fiscal year. We can bring it at any time to make any additional changes, obviously, but we like to establish it since it is a policy to have it established on an annual basis and have board agreement as to what that policy is. We also time this recommended action to coincide with the budget preparation, so it aligns with how we're putting the budget together. Regarding the 2024 investment policy, there are very, very small changes. What you'll see in your packet is the board item, a final requested version, and then a redlining version. There were just a handful of small grammatical changes, some cleanup items that we wanted to put forth, but there have been no statutory changes, investment changes to the state, and we follow those guidelines, obviously. It's a very conservative policy. RTD is not allowed to invest in more volatile investments such as equities. Our primary investments are in federal government instruments such as U.S. Treasuries, federal agency bonds, those types of things. So they're very safe investments. This investment policy is very structured. A lot of it's guided by statutory requirements for governmental agencies in Colorado, what we can and cannot invest in, guides how Brendan and his investment team advisors invest the funds, make sure we're following those. And it really focuses on, in order of importance, safety of principal, liquidity, that the cash is available when RTD needs it, and finally by yield. So investment income is a concern, but it's down the line from ensuring that we're good stewards of taxpayers' money. So again, there's no substantive changes to this investment policy, and it would be in effect for the fiscal year 2024, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. McLeod. At this time, I would ask those directors who have questions or who wish to speak on this matter to raise your virtual hands, and I will call on you in turn. For directors or staff who are calling in, recall you need to press *9 if you wish to speak. Now, before recognizing directors, permit me to highlight what Mr. McLeod just said. The 2024 investment policy recommends only minor administrative, ministerial, editorial, changes to the 2023 policy that you all discussed and approved just 1 year ago. With that, I open the floor to discussion. I see
Two of us did not participate in that conversation, so this is brand new to us. Just want to make that clear. And thank you. It looks great. I appreciate it.
No, I understand, Director Guzman, but the board on which you served last October did, in fact, discuss. Oh, no, wait, you didn't. I'm sorry. That was 22 election. Forgot. Okay, Director Harwick.
I don't need to like get into like major details on this, but I'm just curious, like we're making some administrative changes, like to what end? I mean, just like, what is this? How does this help us? That's really, that's it.
All right, thank you. And Mr. McLeod, do you wish to respond to that?
Yes, thank you. And I think the changes that we're making are so minor. That's not the important point. It's to bring to this governing body what the investment policy will be, and to approve that on an annual basis, just so that everybody's clear and we've had the governing body weigh in on what the policy should be. So that's really the intent of this action item. Thank you for the question.
And it does afford the opportunity, and I apologize, I did misspeak when I say you all approved. Obviously, Director Harwick and Director Guzman did not. But I speak to the others here who did. Director Catlin, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And actually, to Director Guzman's point, I just think it would be good for our new directors to take a look at the policy, even though this board did pass it last year, and I'm still comfortable with it. Just wanted to make sure that other new directors were comfortable with that policy as well. I think it's pretty sound and very prudent, and I'm supportive of it. But if you're new, you might want to take a little closer look at it to see if you're comfortable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director Catlin. Director Guzman, you are recognized.
I just want to say I did read through it. I'm very comfortable with it. And, you know, changing 23 to 24, super simple stuff. I get it. But yeah, no, it's awesome. And it's great to know that we have something that we're relying on to lead and guide. So if there's a question later, we can come back to you with it. And Doug's done an awesome job with us new directors, getting us onboarded properly with the right information. So it's not our first time seeing this, just the changes. So that's great. Thank you for the heads up though, because we've got to make sure that our third new director reviews it as well.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Director Guzman. All right, we have a motion that was made by Chair Geisinger and was seconded by Committee Vice Chair Eric Davidson. And I will ask at this time, are there any no votes on the recommended actions? Hearing none, the record will reflect that the matter has passed unanimously out of the Finance and Planning Committee, and that only Director Deschel was absent from the meeting. The next action before you is the 2024 fiscal policy. And this is for the Board of Directors to approve the 2024 fiscal policy. For the sake of the record, materials for this recommended action can be found at committee packet page 108 through page 121. May I have a motion?
So moved.
I hear Director Catlin as the movement, but I heard Director Guzman in there. Director Guzman, can I hear that as a second?
Second.
Thank you very much, sir. It is so recorded. I will now ask once again, I don't know, who should we get? Why don't we ask our Chief Financial Officer, Doug McLeod, if he could present on this item, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd be happy to. So with this item, similar to the investment policy, this is the actual fiscal policy that we like to bring to the board once a year. There are a few more changes that we're requesting in this one that I'll go through briefly each item. Again, this sets the standards by which we build the budget, essentially, so that you've seen things in there such as the accounting policies, the At the investment, it refers to the investment policy, capital improvement policies, budgeting policies. So really, as a policymaking body, really establishes on an annual basis or more frequently if necessary, what policies we will follow as an agency in terms of keeping financial records and developing forecasts and budgets and the like. So there are a few, the same format. There's a board report, there's a final version, and then there's a red line version that incorporates the changes. And I'll discuss each one of those red line changes that we're requesting here. There, you'll see throughout, there's a few very minor grammatical changes again in this version, in this 2024 fiscal policy. Another item, and these are all laid out in the board report as well. There's a reference in the capital improvement policies to the midterm financial plan that was duplicative in the budget policies. We thought it didn't belong underneath the capital improvement policy, so we just simply moved it down and combined it into the budget policy. It's more of a budget planning type of policy, so it was just an administrative change there. Under fund balance policies, so we've had several discussions or mentioned on several occasions that RTD is in a good financial position. Our intent is to make all of our capital purchases with cash as opposed to borrowing additional money. Typically what we do is, we're out of bonding capacity. We cannot issue more bonds, but we do have the ability to issue certificates of participation, which we historically have done for equipment purchases, rolling stock purchases, buses and trains. But we stopped doing that when we got in a better financial position because we didn't want to incur additional debt and pay additional interest. The one thing that we want to change in this language is to modify just slightly that we'd only purchase capital assets with cash to that we would continue to do that unless it was financially advantageous to do otherwise. So let me explain a little further on that. So why we wanted to change that is currently the cash that we have on hand that we've invested, we're earning over 5% yields on, but the cost to borrow using a certificate of participation is 2.5 to 3% interest. So it's actually, if we were to go out and borrow money, if the board chose to pursue a path of borrowing additional money for some larger project, we might want to consider actually issuing a certificate of participation, because we can keep our cash invested at 5% and only pay 2.5 to 3% and keep that difference. So it's not concrete that we would do that, but we just wanted to have that fiscal policy that it gives us the option as an agency to consider such. Next item, we moved the net revenue coverage ratio from the debt policies to the budget policies. It is a debt policy, however, the debt portion is on the back end, so it kind of is the reporting of what actually happened. But for our budget policies, we want to aim for a net revenue coverage ratio of 1.2% for this, or 1.2 times for this policy. The reason being is that that ratio is calculated by taking total revenues minus operating expenses. The amount that's left over is what would be the credit rating agencies look as what would be available to pay debt. We want to keep that ratio at 1.2 times, so our leftover money is actually 20% higher than what we need to pay our debt. That gives all of our investors as well as our stakeholders comfort knowing that we're not cutting it too close, that we have enough money to fund everything with a little bit of cushion. So that is more on the budgeting side. Moved it to the budget policy because we want to ensure the way we budget ensures that we meet those ratios. That was just a movement of that item. The other significant item that we did is we removed the reference in the budget policies to an amended budget. That doesn't preclude our ability to come and ask the board for an amended budget, but historically what we've done mid-year is we've come to the board and done an amended budget to update the budget. Our general manager and CEO, Deborah Johnson, has been talking about we need to eliminate the budget for a few years now, the amended portion of that. To really be intentional in our budgeting and stick to what we're budgeting and not have changes, which we all agree to. So that's the intent of removing that amended budget. Doesn't mean we still might not come with certain changes to the board or request for different appropriations, but this wholesale amending of the budget going forward is not probably a good business practice. It'll force us to plan a little bit better. Finally, Mr. Chair, just one more item. One of the items that we have in there, we refer to the 6-year midterm financial plan, the MTFP. We would like to change that in 2024 to a 5-year financial forecast. We still need to come up with a catchy acronym. General Manager Johnson has called it the F cubed, the triple F for 5-year financial forecast. Something pithy and clever like the MTFP, but we thought it would be more appropriate to be, we really didn't have a good justification for choosing 6 years. And the longer out you go, a 6-year plan, the further out you go, the less certain it is, less accurate it's going to be. We thought we'd go to the industry standard, and what our general manager is used to is a 5-year financial forecast. So what we would do is start presenting the budget year plus 5 years as opposed to the budget year plus 6 years. So that concludes each of the changes that we're requesting to this 2024 fiscal policy, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. McLeod. So at this time, I would like to ask those directors who have questions or who wish to speak to raise your virtual hands. I will call on you in turn. For directors or staff calling in, please recall, press *9 on your phone. Permit me to frame this discussion a little bit by noting that the key focus that I heard from these policy changes is principally to do that which is financially advantageous to the agency, always a good goal, and to bring our financial planning process into alignment with the industry by going from a 6-year focus to a 5-year focus. If it's a 5-year financial forecast, I think it's a FIFE, by the way. With that, the floor is now open, and I will recognize Director Catlin first.
Thank you. Sorry to dominate some of this conversation. First of all, I think I've stated before, but I'm a little bit nervous about a 1.2 coverage ratio. I would personally like to see that a little higher, but as far as the changes that you've proposed for this fiscal policy, I'm comfortable with it, but I just wanted to state that I just would really like to see a little bit more cushion there. But with regard to that 20%, does that include our budgeted reserve? Is that included in that 20%? Or is the budgeted 3-month reserve, operating reserve, included in the base? Am I making any sense? I don't know.
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Yes, please, Mr. McLeod.
Thank you. No, and point well taken. Certainly, for financial success, we certainly want to have the most money and have the highest ratios that we can in that respect. Where we're trying to balance that is the expectation that we'll spend the taxpayer dollars on service. So, we cut back on service and put more money away and have 1.3 debt service coverage ratio. By the way, that ratio, we always pay our debt first. So especially with the bonds, the Department of Revenue takes the taxes, the sales tax remittance from the Department of Revenue, goes to a trustee. They take out what's necessary to pay the bond payments and hold it in trust to make sure that we're paying that debt on time. So that really comes out first. But in terms of looking at it from a credit rating agency or an investor standpoint, that 1.2 ratio is really looking at, what's left over. And frankly, that 0.2 can be used and is used for other things such as capital expenditures. So really the formula is total revenues minus operating expenses, whatever leftovers pay debt. And the 0.2 also needs to kind of be left over to pay capital expenditures. So and to answer your second question, because we have fluctuations in our revenue and expenses, so sometimes our expenses will pop up a little bit each year just because we'll have certain one-time projects, and then they'll come back down. In those years, they only look at it on an income statement basis. They do not take the balance sheet and our fund reserves into account when they look at that debt service coverage ratio to calculate it itself, but they do take into context, hey, all right, RTD for 1 or 2 years fell below 1.2, for instance. But if you did look at their balance sheet, they have $1 billion in reserves. So we as a credit rating agency aren't super concerned about that, as long as their forecast, the financial forecast, shows they're going to get back on track. So that's kind of a quick way of, it's like most financial metrics, you got to kind of take it into context, but the calculation itself is just a strict revenues minus expenses divided by debt service.
Anything further, Director Catlin, you wanted to add to that?
No, I'm fine. I'm obviously familiar with other debt financing where their coverage ratios are higher and the ratings are higher. So I just, in the case of, it's comparing apples to oranges, but in some cases I've seen debt coverage ratios of higher than 2, which, that's a really healthy position. But as you said, it's taxpayer dollars and you have to really balance and spend them wisely. So I'll get off my soapbox, but I just I'd feel more comfortable with a higher coverage ratio, but that's just my preference. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Please feel free to supplement Mr. McLeod.
Thank you. What I was going to add, Director Catlin, is we actually have been in the 1.3, 1.4 for a few years, particularly with COVID funding, because our revenue is so high. But we anticipate being quite a bit above that 1.2 by 1 or 2 percentage or basis points going forward. So I think we will continue to exceed that, and the 1.2 is really just a floor that we don't want to try to drop below.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And that makes me feel better.
And thank you, Director Catlin, for your involvement. And please, for someone who was the Deputy Executive Director of CDOT for 11 years, your input is never questioned or regretted. So please continue to participate to the fullest extent possible. Vice Chair Davidson, you are recognized now, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Mr. McLeod. I'm certainly glad to see some of the changes. I think being intentional with the budget is important. We've talked a lot about our capital carry forward and that being a symptom of kind of seeing things getting postponed. Also makes a lot of sense to move to a 5-year look on a forecast as opposed to the midterm financial plan that we've been doing. I just wondered if you wouldn't mind speaking generally, and I think this may be as much to General Manager and CEO Johnson as to you, Mr. McLeod, just about the changes that are coming to the budgeting process. And I know that you all have been talking about that and talking about operational changes, and wondering if you can just share a little bit more context and a little bit more about those ongoing changes with the committee.
Vice Chair, I'm going to allow the question if there can be a brief response, but it's beyond the scope of the motion. And so I don't really want to get us too far afield, but let's take a couple minutes for Mr. McLeod to respond to that, or General Manager CEO Johnson, should she choose.
And I can clarify with specifically with respect to if we would do away with the amended budget as the expectation, which has really been the case, and certainly I've been on the board. Just speaking to the process that is going to get us to a position where there is no longer a material need to do so would be helpful context.
Thank you. That helps clarify that. And let me recognize our General Manager and CEO, Deborah Johnson, to respond to it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very kindly, Vice Chair, for the question. As I have shared with you all, we need to be more intentional relative to our fiduciary responsibility and recognizing that this body did adopt a strategic plan in which we talk about 4 strategic priorities. I look to those priorities as the functional pillars of which decisions are made. And more specifically, as discussed last night at the Operations and Safety Committee, there's 3 initiatives of which we collectively as a management and leadership team are focused on, quite naturally being that of getting back to basics, which is the state of the repair and just establishing processes and procedures. Our people power, which Director Whitmore talked about the importance of retention. And then lastly, a welcoming transit environment. And so as we look to make decisions going forward, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, coming into the organization, I recognize that we weren't necessarily forecasting in the best ability, to the best of our ability. And oftentimes the amended budget process was used just out of, not a necessity, but out of past practice. And so working in conjunction with CFO McLeod and members of his team and having conversations with our leadership team, we have decided to be more intentional create that sense of ownership amongst people in the organization and be very transparent and not do things in a siloed approach. We are focused on one RTD, recognizing that one individual in this organization can't do anything by themselves. And more specifically, we need to look at it from the vantage point of what is it that we need to accomplish, and looking to discern whether or not is it regulatory compliance. Are there core aspects that we need to include in budget requests that are going to impact us doing our core business functions? And third, what are the interdependencies? So recognizing that this is going to be an evergreen change as we come full steam ahead, there will be continuous improvement. And this is the first foray as we look at what we're doing with operational expenses and capital expenses. And so it's across the agency holistically. And so I'll yield the floor to Mr. McLeod. So that's what I would offer at this juncture. So thank you very much for the question and for the opportunity to respond.
Thank you very much, and kudos to you for avoiding the use of the phrase "out of laziness" when you were describing that process. Mr. McLeod, she has yielded the floor to you, so you are recognized, sir.
Thank you. I think General Manager Johnson really encapsulated where we need to go as an agency, and this has been needing to have been done for quite a while. I'm very encouraged by it. I really think we, as you mentioned, we could be much more intentional, not only very intentional in what we're budgeting, but ensuring that we're actually executing, and we're only budgeting for the items that we intend on completing during the fiscal year. So I'm encouraged by that. We've already taken some steps, as you know, under General Manager Johnson's direction to kind of clean up some of the things like capital carry forward. And you'll see that as we go through the budgeting process, that we're going to be much more in line with what the strategic plan is saying. And part of employee ownership is one of the strategic priorities, is to ensure that people are executing on what they say they're going to execute on, and be efficient with the taxpayer dollars, that we don't tie them up. In years past, we've had fairly large budget underruns to where we over budgeted to a certain extent because we haven't been able to execute due to people power and other issues. But we want to be very methodical and intentional in how we're budgeting, appropriating money, and actually executing on what we say we're going to complete. So that's all I'm at. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. McLeod. Are there any further comments or questions relative to this recommended action? Director Guzman, you are recognized.
I just quickly want to say, I think part of my resistance to the Leeds School of Business is that it forecasts out so far, so that you're pulling it back even 1 year makes me feel more comfortable that that budgeting process and those forecasts are going to make more sense, because it allows more nimbleness in receiving that information quickly and adjusting properly. Not needing to amend a budget all the time necessarily, but really having a realistic look on what's coming up on the horizon. 6 years seems so far away, and we don't know what's going to happen in 45 days, if you catch my drift. So I thank you for that, and I'm glad that this is on here. I'm in support of it.
Thank you very much, Director Guzman. Any other comments or questions from the committee members or from any board members? Hearing none, let me ask at this time on the motion made by Director Catlin and seconded by Director Guzman, are there any no votes on this action? Hearing none, then the recommended action is passed unanimously. And when I say unanimously, that refers to 6 aye votes and 0 no votes. And Director Deschel is permissively absent from this meeting. The matter will proceed to the consent agenda for the full board meeting. The final action item that we have for this evening is the 2024-2029 midterm financial plan, referred to as the MTFP. And the recommended action is for the board of directors to adopt the 2024-2029 midterm financial plan, the MTFP. For the sake of the record, the materials for this recommended action are found at committee packet page 122 through page 134. And before asking for a motion, let me explain for the sake of the record why we are revisiting this item. As you may recall, this item was brought forward as a recommended action item to the Finance Committee on September 12th, and after a full discussion was passed unanimously. However, prior to the September Executive Committee meeting, a formula error was identified by staff that required correction. At the request of the GM CEO, Chair Geisinger removed the item from the September board meeting agenda to allow the MTFP to be corrected by staff. We are bringing this item back through the committee to follow our pre-established best practices and to honor the role of our standing committee in the board's governance structure. To emphasize the point again, the only change to the MTFP that you previously passed unanimously is the correction of some numbers, as Mr. McLeod will explain further. With that as background, do we have a motion to approve the 2024-2029 midterm financial plan as amended by staff?
So moved.
I have a motion by Director Guzman. Is there a second?
Second, Davidson. No.
I heard Harwick first, so I'm going to give it to him, Mr. Vice Chair. And I would now ask, I'm stumbling again now, who am I going to go to? All right, well, look, we'll start with our Chief Financial Officer, Doug McLeod, and we'll kind of just take it from there. But we're also going to have a tag team, and we have Todd Nickel, our Senior Manager of Budget, who will be available to present on this item. But Mr. McLeod, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In a moment, I will call up the revised MTFP presentation, midterm financial plan presentation that's been changed since the September 12th presentation. Thank you for setting that up. I appreciate the board's, the committee's patience and considering this a second time. I regret that we did not catch this error the first time. It was there and just missed it. Our intent is not to let that happen again, this formula error. We have error checks in place to ensure that this particular one doesn't happen again. So with that said, and I do thank you, General Manager Johnson also sent out communication to the board members notifying you that we would be pulling this item from the agenda for September. So appreciate her support with this too, and we'll get it right this time. So what I intend to do is pull up the same presentation that was given on September 12th, but just skip down to the cash flows where the numbers change and explain what has changed since that time, Mr. Chair. So let me share my screen. Mr. Chair, can you confirm that you see the presentation on screen?
Yes, sir. I can confirm it is visible on our screens now.
Thank you very much. So as I mentioned, again, this is background information. These first several slides, no changes there. Just explaining the thought process behind development of the midterm financial plan. Again, this is the 6-year financial forecast past the 2023 budget year. So it goes into 2029 revenues and expenditures. So just to explain where the error occurred. So we have, when we talk about our sets of financial books, our financial records, we've talked about that we have a book, a business for the base system, which is the 6/10 sales and use tax. Then we have a separate book within our financial system for the fast tracks system, which is the 4/10 sales and use tax. The reason why we keep those two entities separate is because per voter authorization, 4/10 funding cannot be spent on the base system side, but the base system funding can be used on fast tracks. So we need to keep those numbers separate in the way we account for things. I'm going to talk a little bit about allocation. So not to get too deep into the accounting for this, but what happens is all of the invoices, payroll, everything else is paid out of the base system. That is because we have one set of bank accounts. And if you think about it, it would be really hard to take, for instance, my salary and allocate it between base system and fast tracks for every invoice, for every paycheck, etc. So what we do is we actually pay everything out of the base system. Then we calculate based on activity on fast tracks, how much of that total expense belongs to fast tracks, allocate that expense by reducing the base systems books and increasing the fast track systems books. So if you look at it in total, there's really no change when we do that allocation. It's just trying to get the two pieces stated correctly for the fair presentation of their financial position. When we were putting together the midterm financial plan, there was a formula error that we encountered with that allocation. So this is a plan. So we do this allocation within software. It's different from our actual set of books where we actually book expenses. So it's just an outlook and it's a financial plan. So we do certain calculations to put these numbers together within the software. That allocation was actually over allocating the expenses from the base system over to fast tracks, making it appear that the operating expenses, this line item operating expense less depreciation for the base system, was actually showing as lower than it should have been because too many of the expenses were pushed over to the fast tracks system. Likewise, if you were to look at that previous version of the operating expenses on the fast track set of books, it was much higher than it should have been. In fact, if you were to compare this midterm financial plan with the one presented last year, the operating expenses on fast tracks were almost double what they were last year. So once this was pointed out, we realized we had a problem, pulled it from the agenda and fixed the allocation. But the question that arose was, well, geez, fast tracks looks like it's losing a lot of money and the base system is going to have to subsidize a lot more of the fast tracks operating expenses, when in fact the operating expenses were incorrectly stated. So to wrap it up, what we did is we corrected the formulas within here. So now the operating expenses for each entity are correct. And you can see on the bottom line there, the net cash flow. So that's everything that comes in and goes out the door for fast tracks in terms of finances. It shows a positive, and these are stated in thousands. So in 2023, it shows a $32.6 million net cash flow. So you can see it's all positive. There's not subsidization necessary. Just the subsidization idea was that once the base system paid off its debt, which happens in 2024, to free up cash flow in case the fast track system needed additional financial support. That's not the case here in the next 6 years through 2029. Could be the case down the road, don't know for sure, but because the base system can fund fast tracks, but not vice versa, it was the prudent thing to do in terms of planning cash flow and cash availability to support the entire system. So going on to the consolidated total. So this bottom line, sorry, net cash flow, not the bottom line, the bolded line, the net cash flow. This actually, so there was a problem between the allocation between the two, but in fact, not only had the base system over allocated, but there was an additional allocation just on the fast track side, overstating the total expenses. So sorry to make this too confusing, but what ended up happening when we fixed those formulas is the bottom line actually changed too. So the bottom line net cash flow of the 6-year period plus this year is a positive $171 million, $107.9 million. So it sounds like a lot of money, but it's really not when you consider revenue of $9.1 billion. It's about a 2% variation. Again, this is a 6-year forecast, so these numbers get a little softer as you go out. So it's not something to hang our hat on, but it does at least show that we have an overbalanced budget with it projected to be at least balanced and have enough money to fund reserves still and end up with a net positive cash flow. So, Mr. Chair, I believe that kind of encapsulates the problem that we're trying to rectify by bringing this back to this committee, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. McLeod. At this time, I would like to ask those directors who have questions or who wish to speak to this matter to please raise your virtual hands, and I will call on you in turn. For directors who are online with a telephone, if you wish to speak, please press *9. And to reiterate, we are not here this evening to reinvent the wheel. We already discussed this matter at length last month, and we are here to review only some revisions in some numbers. And for the sake of the record, I would like to acknowledge and extend appreciation to Nate Miner of Colorado Public Radio, for raising this issue with our staff. The floor is now open, and I will recognize our board chair, Lynn Geisinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Doug. It's sort of, it is a little bit back into the mix of this, but to answer Director Guzman's question earlier, and sort of based on our conversation today, as you go forward in this MTFP, you did cap the growth based on a Tabor limit. Is that right?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. McLeod.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Chair Geisinger, for pointing that out. I forgot to mention that. So you're absolutely right. So when we talked earlier about the forecast that CU Leads provides, those numbers that are stated in that board memo are strictly related to what they provided us in the forecast. When we take those numbers and put it into the midterm financial plan, you're correct. What we do is we actually adjust down a little bit. So they show that they have a 3.3% annual increase on average in their forecast for the base system, because we have this potential Tabor revenue growth limitation issue looming starting in 2025. For the midterm financial plan, what we've done is we've limited that growth to 1.4% instead of the average 3.3% each year. So it's not a lot, but it takes it back down a little bit to be a little bit more conservative than what the professionals are saying we should collect. And that 1.4% is based on analysis that was done by a subcontractor of WSP that did the Reimagine contract. They looked at the growth in property tax valuations within the district over 10 years, and it increased by 1.4%. So that's really the only basis that we have to go on. So we use that number for a placeholder for now, but thank you for pointing that out. We are trying to be a little bit more conservative than what the forecast actually showed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions or comments from any member of the committee or any director? Director Harwick, you are recognized.
Sorry, and I probably should have asked this question last time, but I'm just curious about, so hypothetically, and this is about debrucing. So maybe this is the right time, maybe this is wrong. And if it's wrong, just tell me it's wrong time. So hypothetically, we see this post cliff in 2025. If we don't go to the voters before then this happens, but let's say we decide, okay, 2026 feels more favorable. If we go to then and debruce, like we're not, then all of this sort of bad financial situation that might be happening in theory could go away. Am I understanding that correctly? We're not stuck at that lower level, even if we debruce. Are we? Did that make sense? Sorry.
You are right, Director Harwick. This is not the right time.
Okay. That's
having
fine.
been said.
Yeah, I know.
That having been said, if Mr. McLeod wishes to offer any comment on that briefly, he may.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, just really briefly, and yes, you're right, and that's one of the strategies that we're trying to with the revenue diversification group. So that's one strategy, right? So we're not so dependent on sales and use taxes potentially that we can spread that out. We're not so susceptible to those swings where we drop down and then be limited in our growth back up. So that's one strategy. The other issue is just the Tabor growth limitations that would really only affect in 2025 the base system. Fast Tracks is debruced until 2050. So that whole investigation, we've got to get all of our facts straight, and that's part of what we've done with this revenue diversification group, which we met for the first time yesterday. I believe Vice Chair Davis is going to share some additional information, but yeah, that's the intent of this organization is what is our policy prescription for addressing these things. There will be more to come. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. McLeod, and thank you, Director Harwick. And I couldn't avoid the joke. All right, are there any other comments or questions? Chair Geisinger, you are recognized.
I'm sort of on this thing, and Doug and I discussed it, but in page 122, it says sales and use tax projections provided in August 2023 by the University of Colorado Leeds School of Business project a $31.7 million decrease over the March 2023 forecast. I think, Doug, that what we're talked about is their projections were at 21.5 million, But with your in other words, this may need, this memo may need a little adjustment with your 1.4%, with your change, the change that you made, it came to 31.7 million. Is that right?
Yes.
While you're recognized.
Thank you. Yeah, correct. And thank you for pointing that out. It's incorrectly worded. So it really should say that the forecast provided by CU Leads did show a $21 million decrease. However, RTD staff, with General Manager Johnson's approval, reduced that down for the additional, down to the 1.4% on the base system side to be more conservative. So the difference between those two numbers. So yes, I'll look at if we can adjust that language for the final package. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So we could simply adjust that number for presentation in the final report that is attached to the minutes as a part of this process. Any other comments or questions from the committee or any director? Seeing none, let me now ask on the motion by Director Guzman as seconded by Director Harwick, are there any no votes on this item? Hearing no expression of no votes, then we have a unanimous vote on the recommended action. It will proceed to the consent agenda. That's 6 aye votes, 0 no votes. And Director Deschel is, as we said previously, excused for his absence. And this may be the last time that this committee has to talk about the MTFP. And from now on, we'll talk about the FIFE and go from there. All right. That concludes our recommended actions for this evening. There is one discussion item on the agenda, and that item is for the 2024 proposed budget. Now, for the sake of the record, the materials for this discussion item are found at committee packet page 135 through page 165. And let me give my own introduction as chair. As you all know, the budget is one of the most important functions of this committee and of the RTD board. And for that reason, we take an extraordinary amount of time in its preparation. We take information from the CU Leeds School of Business. We engage with all of our departments. We incorporate and take into account numerous other studies and initiatives that we have put in place. We create a 6-year, now presumably, hopefully amended to a 5-year FIFE forecast. We then draft a proposed budget and have a discussion to examine that proposed budget. And at long last, we create a final budget and hold a public hearing on that. And then and only then take action to approve a final budget. Transparency and accountability are the keys throughout this entire process. With that in mind, I now ask, just because there's nobody else to ask, and I'm going to ask the marathon man, Doug McLeod, our Chief Financial Officer, and Todd Nickel, our Senior Manager of Budget, to present this item. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Tisdale. And I have a presentation to walk through here just momentarily. I did want to point out too that within the board package that there's a board report followed by the actual budget document. That's the document that we intend to present for or make available for public inspection. You'll note that there's a letter from the general manager included in there, some narrative information. It's a really good document. I hope and very informative that you'll have the chance to read it. But I wanted to point that out to this committee. And without further ado, I will share my screen with a presentation of the actual numbers. Mr. Chair, can you confirm that you can see that?
Yes, sir.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so this is the 2024 proposed budget. We call it a proposed budget because it's not the official budget until it goes through the process of the board approving and appropriating the funding. And I'm Doug McLeod, obviously, and Todd Nichols here too to help answer any questions that may come up. Just a quick review that the proposed budget timeline, the chair mentioned this This draft budget is presented to this body as a discussion item. So it will not go to the full board, but it is presented in open forum at this meeting. And then it is also provided for public inspection through posting on our website. We also are required by state statute to provide notice in 2 daily newspapers. So we put a notice out in the Boulder Daily Camera and the Denver Post saying that RTD's budget is available for public inspection. You can find it here at our website, for instance, or some contact information. We also leave a copy over in the board office if anybody wants to come in and inspect it in person. That has to be done by October 15th per statute. So we get this post out there for public consumption, public review. It is posted until it is approved. And we would come back to this committee on November 14th at the next Finance and Planning Committee to present this as an action item. In that intervening period, there may be a few adjustments that we're continuing discussions. We don't anticipate any large adjustments, but we've had several discussions, departmental and then consolidated discussions with the general manager, go through the budgets with a fine-tooth comb. Those can continue to happen after we've had a decision on what those numbers look like to present to this body. Tonight, there will be additional discussion, really going through it one more time with each department. So there may be some changes. When we bring back the action item, there will be a schedule included from what was presented in this meeting to anything that changed by line item to the final presentation. So you'll be able to see what we're actually requesting for appropriation and what changed during the comment period. So I've mentioned that our budget process is improving each year. We already discussed some of the intents of our general manager and this agency in terms of becoming better at budgeting, more intentional, having more frequent meetings, more frequent reviews, to have an agency-wide understanding of where we stand on projects, et cetera. So we continue to refine that project, really try to narrow down some of our asset management plan, prepare and replace schedules to prioritize those along the strategic plan. So I would say we've gone through a very detailed budget process, and we intend to continue to improve this going into next year. This proposed budget aligns with the 2024 through 2029 MTFP midterm financial plan. So what we use the MTFP for is we first set a target of what's a sustainable operating expense level, as well as what we know that needs to be replaced on a capital expenditure basis. Those two numbers are the targets that are used for the development of the budget. As you can imagine, the budget requests always come in higher than what that projection shows. And as we talk more about it and are more intentional about what we're actually going to execute on, our target is to bring those numbers in line with what the midterm financial plan shows as a fiscally sustainable amount. So that was the target that this was based on. Again, it aligns with the strategic plan initiatives. So within this plan, you'll see in the narrative, there's discussion items that relate back to these specific items, explicitly back to basics, people power, welcoming transit environment. So I won't spend a lot of time discussing that since it is in the document. Some of the assumptions, fair study and equity analysis was taken into account, as the board knows, and approved. Those recommendations the board approved are being implemented for being in effect in early 2024. We've taken that into account in adjusting the fair revenue to what the projections are, which is lower than what we've historically seen. We've talked already about the forecasted sales and use taxes from CU leads in the budget. Again, 2024, we will not be subject to TABOR limitations, so we did not reduce the growth. We used the actual sales and use tax forecast for 2024 from CU leads. That doesn't come into effect until 2025. The operating expenses were based on the system optimization plan and what we're currently spending, in addition to open positions are included. All these frontline positions that remain filled that were discussed during last evening's presentations, those positions are actually budgeted within this budget. We do have a provision within there so we don't over budget for vacancy savings, knowing that there will be turnover and there's a time period of when hires start to adjust it accordingly on our biggest cost in the agency, which is compensation. We've assumed a 5.1% inflation rate. The July Bureau of Labor Statistics inflation rate that came out for the Denver Lakewood Aurora is what they call it, the area in our surrounding district, was at 4.7% in July. We use 5.1%. The math actually worked out that way because we have certain adjustments that are different from inflation. So there's different components such as labor. We have contractual increases. We have contractual increases within a lot of our contracts for a lot of the services that we contract out that are built in that arrive at that 5.1% inflation. All this is to say that I think that we're being conservative and assuming what the inflation costs will be in 2024. We're not at our historical 3% inflation rate. We're assuming 5.1%. A big component of our not only our budget but our longer term planning is the transit asset management plan. The FTA requires that we submit a transit asset management plan at least once every 4 years, and if there's any updates or significant changes to that plan, we need to notify them and submit a new plan. It's very specific and very prescriptive in terms of the way we evaluate our assets. We're still working on continuing to develop that plan and make it more solidified and more ingrained in our process. But as far as the financial planning for that, that's one of the key elements to ensure that we have the funding to make sure that our assets are maintained in a state of good repair. Then again, we allow a provision to maintain our reserves according to policy. Within the fiscal policy, we still have the requirement to maintain 3 months of operating reserves, excluding depreciation. It's kind of our rainy days. But we actually have more than that 3 months currently, but this budget also maintains those reserves at or above those levels required in fiscal policy. Just quickly, strategic priority alignment. Again, I touched on this earlier, but that's the big thing. You know, when there are new budget requests or new initiatives that are brought forward in the budget process, budget preparation process, a big part of the discussion is how does that align with our strategic priorities and our strategic initiatives? People power constraints is a big item, obviously, and I mentioned that we budgeted for positions that we think is adequate for what we think our turnover as well as our net hiring. Because obviously we have a lot of open positions, but we're not going to hire them all on January 1st. So we've budgeted accordingly and ratably, such as with the police department. We know that we've had approximately 35 officers in the budget, so that's been planned for and it's been scheduled throughout the year. I mentioned during the fiscal policy discussion that we're going to discontinue the amended budget process. This will be the first time that we've done this since I've been here. I'm not concerned. I'm glad that we're doing it. I think it's really good for us as an agency and for all of us staff members to ensure that we adhere to that budgeted, what was originally set forth and appropriated by the budget through the budget process. We still have the ability to be flexible. There's certain delegations and certain board responsibilities in terms of moving money for those appropriations that we would come to the board certainly for certain items that fall within that purview to ask for additional funding or transfer of funding if necessary, but we're not going to do the one big amended budget. I wanted to point out that I still believe we're in a strong financial position, which is good. We have about $1 billion in cash and investments, also in reserves, about $500 million on the basis and $500 million on fast tracks. So we're in a good position to weather a storm. We don't want to burn through that money because it's really earmarked over several years to maintain our assets. But I don't see us getting into a lot of trouble and being in a panic trying to figure out what we're going to do, at least in the short term, if there is a big economic event. So this is all to say is total what will be requested for an operating budget is $856 million. That's right on in line with what we included in the midterm financial plan for 2024, and approximately $58 million in capital. We're still going through that. There's going to be some carry forward. So when we get down to cash flows, you'll see that it's 32 million, but those were our targets. Beyond that, when we asked for the actual appropriation of November. Just quickly, this is what the revenue picture looks like. So you can see we've had really good growth. The orange bars are the COVID funding, which was good because you can see the blue bars from our regular recurring funding really dropped during COVID. That was a great help to us, not only to sustain operations, but it also allowed us to save some of the excess sales and use tax and build our reserves during that time, getting us in a good financial position. The growth, the growth that you see from 2023 budget to 2024 budget is mostly due to sales and use tax growth, but we also will be receiving additional funding through the bipartisan infrastructure law for our preventive maintenance grants. We used to receive about $100 million a year. That goes up to $130 million in 2024. So that's also helpful, but pretty confident that our revenues, by the way, the lower fares are embedded in there too. So still seeing some growth in 2024. This is in the presentation too, just to give you an idea of how our expenses break down by category in the budget. Again, wages and benefits are our largest category. In fact, General Manager Johnson often refers to them being 3/4 of our expenditures. And if you were to take what's in purchase transportation and our services, those are our contracted services. If you took the wage portion out of that, what are being paid for wages for folks that are being contracted, this slice of the pie for compensation would actually be closer to 75%. So just to give you an idea, that's how dependent we are on people power for our business. Then you can see some of the other expenses broken down there. To give you an idea of the cash flows, so this is our income statement. We have a column for 2023 budget versus what we're presenting tonight for the proposed 2024 budget. A couple items I just focus on: total revenue in row 5 with the blue number there. You can see the increase projected to be about 62 million next year. All of our operating expenses are summed up in row 14. There's 856,165,000. You can see the components that make that up. So it's just really small growth over last year. And what I'd point out is why that, even though we're including 5.1% inflation, the reason why that's only growing by $1 million, less than $1 million next year over this year, is because we're really, as I mentioned, being very intentional and specific about how we budget, instead of budgeting everything that we might want to do and not actually accomplishing that. So in fact, we're over budgeted in 2023. We're really going to be close to our budget in 2024. So we want to be very specific in what items we're budgeting for. That's what wow. Debt service, row 15 there. You can see that's come down a bit. That'll continue to be at that level. Those are really due to the refinancings. We've reduced some of our debt service needs, so that's been really helpful. Even though it's only $2 million, it's much more over 7 years. CapEx, we have $32 million in there. That number that I showed you, the $58 million, also includes some of the capital carry forward, which is not included in this number yet. So we're going to be, when we come back to you, the capital carry forward will be 58 million or thereabouts. We have to reconcile that carry forward when we get enough data. Have to pick a point in time and say, okay, this is what hasn't been completed on these already started projects. That's our number that we include in this budget. So that will get updated. What you can see there on the bottom line is net cash flow of 145,978,000. We're anticipating in 2024 that will change slightly with the capital carry forward, as well as if there's any tweaks that we do between now and November. We expect those to be small, if any. That money actually will go into the capital replacement and also be used to build up our this contribution reserves. Every year, as our expenses increase, if we're going to keep that 3 month unrestricted operating reserve, as our expenses increase, the 3 month reserve needs to increase. So we add, next year we'll add $5 million to keep that at 3 months, and then everything excess of that 145 goes into the capital replacement. So, Mr. Chair, that concludes the presentation. One thing I was going to add is during this intervening period, I know this is just a discussion item tonight, but we are available if any board members or committee members want to see more detail. If you need questions, we have contact information on what we're putting out there. You know how to get a hold of me. Please don't hesitate if you want to have more details, have more discussion about the proposal. And I'll stop there, Mr. Chair, and ask for questions.
Thank you, Mr. McLeod. As I say, be careful what you wish for, you might get it. Let me start with Vice Chair Davidson. You are recognized, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. McLeod, thank you for going through all of that. And to Mr. Nickel as well for being here and supporting this. Just one question. First of all, it's great that we are seeing the debt service. It's some of those older midterm financial plans we can actually see. It's big enough to show up here, so that's great. And just a point of clarity on the capital expenditures. I think you answered the question I had, which is the presentation referenced the 58. But you mentioned that included the capital carry forward, and then you mentioned the capital carry forward amount. Is it correct that the capital carry forward will be the difference between the 32 and the 58 that you referenced? So it'll be 26 is about what you expect the carry forward to be. Is that right?
Sorry, yeah, I may not have said that correctly. So our capital, let me explain just a little bit more. Sorry, Mr. Chair, I'm just jumping right in. But the capital carry forward used to be about 567 million, and it was growing year after year after year. And what we realized is we've got all these projects that we've agreed to fund, but we haven't been executing on them. That's why it's, it's growing. So we undertook this initiative. We got it down to about 200 million. So I'm sorry, I didn't state that correctly. The capital carry forward will be in addition to the 58. The 58, what's shown in the 32 right now is the asset management plan, things that we know of, and we're still evaluating the new capital that will come into play there. But our target is the 58. So it may not be at 58, but that's what we're, not that we have to spend it, but that's what we think we have available depending on whether we execute it. And to clarify on the capital carry forward, so that money has already been appropriated. It's approximately 200 million after we reconcile it. So the money has already been dedicated to it. That money is sitting over on the balance sheet where we're just looking at the income statement. So that money is already earmarked to take care of the ongoing capital carry forward. So there's really no necessarily impact, but it will still have to be appropriated. That capital carry forward will continue to be appropriated for future years.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's very, very helpful. Thank you. Yeah, very different numbers, and that makes sense. So this is the appropriation of that and bringing that in. Thank you for that additional clarification. I appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Vice Chair. Director Guzman, you are recognized, sir.
Thank you. I don't know if this is for Deborah or General Manager CEO or the Chief Financial Officer. I'm very comfortable with you guys, and I'm a very comfortable person. I'm so sorry. I try to remember every time I forget. With respect to the budgeting numbers for capital expenditures, I want to hear from you that we are not tying your hands to not be able to meet what you are planning to do this next year with these numbers, that you are confident that this is going to be the sufficient amount of monetary investment you need to keep our system in a state of good repair, and also to fund any other operational needs that you have. I just want to make sure that I hear that and it's on the record that you are confident in this. And if there's any reservation, can you please speak to that so that we can request those adjustments be made and take another look at this? I'm confident that you presented us the right information, Mr. McLeod. Deborah, General Manager CEO Johnson, I would love to get your feedback on that. Thank you.
General Manager CEO, you are recognized to respond.
Thank you very much, Chair Tisdale, and thank you very much, Director Guzman, for your question. I will state that this is another process that's evergreen as we look at the capital carry forward, and recognizing that I have shared with Mr. McLeod, finance and budgeting staff, as well as members of the leadership team, when it comes to our transit asset management plan, that is our guidepost. We are looking at critical aspects. We do not put a price tag on safety. So there could be some reallocation of funds as it relates to what we have before us. And Mr. McLeod made reference earlier on in the presentation about subsequent meetings that we're having with the leadership team, because there are some projects that have been on the books that have yet to come to fruition that we need to ensure come to fruition as we look at our facilities that may have not been kept up to par relative to what our TAM may have indicated. So those are the types of things when we come back to you with the proposed recommendation for the budget in November, on November 14th, that we will shore up, because we have a greater opportunity to align the capital projects with those three strategic initiatives. So I can't answer the question right now, but I am like 85% confident that we are going to address all things safety related, because that's where our priorities rest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam General Manager CEO Johnson. We appreciate your input on that very important point and the question that Director Guzman raised. Are there other questions or comments from committee members or directors? Seeing none, I have one that I just wanted to direct to our CFO, and that's relative to the 5.1% inflation rate that is utilized as one of your basic assumptions. I recognize that currently statewide, we're at almost 5.2% for this year, with a projection that it will drop down to close under 4% next year. And you've looked at all of that, I know, but I also know that the Denver, Aurora, Lakewood MSA is historically significantly higher than the statewide inflation rate. And I just want to make sure that you're very comfortable with that 5.1% inflation rate that you have used for planning purposes in this proposed budget.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, it's comfortable based on current information as we can be. Now, you know, I think most, and you saw this in the CU Leads presentations, most that the inflation rate spiked up to around 10% and slowly been trickling back down because the higher interest rates that the Fed has been putting in place, trying to slow the economy down. So, you know, there's probably a better chance that inflation will be lower than what we're assuming. Being at 4.7, 5.2 currently, and we budgeted 5.1, it's probably a better chance of it going lower, but it could certainly go higher. I think one of the bigger concerns we have, I mean, inflation certainly, if it jumps a lot higher, will be a big concern. But one of the bigger concerns we have is just the metrics that were provided in terms of availability of people. 1.9 jobs for every one unemployed person. The other issue being supply chain constraints that we're still incurring some real challenges there. And so what we're seeing is some of our vendors coming back and asking for increases to their contracts just because when they bid it 2 or 3 years ago, inflation wasn't where we are now. So they're struggling too. So it's really a lot of moving pieces. But to answer your question, I feel pretty comfortable about the 5.1% at this point.
All right, thank you very much. I appreciate that, sir. Are there any other comments or questions from the committee members or from any director relative to the 2024 proposed budget? All right, hearing that, we have concluded the discussion on that discussion item. Are there any other matters that a director wishes to bring forward at this time? Vice Chair Davidson, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At the last Finance and Planning Committee meeting, I had committed to keep this committee apprised on the ongoings of the Revenue Diversification Working Group that has formed within staff. Again, just as a reminder, this is a staff-led group that's looking at opportunities to diversify our revenue as well as to look for opportunities to make our revenue and our financial position more resilient. This is in reaction to the discussion we had at the board retreat earlier this year regarding our commitment to financial success. The working group from a staff perspective is comprised of our CEO and General Manager, Deborah Johnson, General Counsel, Melanie Snyder, Chief Financial Officer, Doug McLeod, Government Relations Officer, Michael Davies, and Senior Manager of Debt Investments, Mr. Brendan Morgan. And the working group met yesterday on October 2nd. Dare I say the theme is a common set of facts at this point, is working together to really establish where we are. General Counsel Snyder has been doing some investigation ahead of this in terms of what our financial opportunities are now as they are currently permitted under RTD's enabling legislation. So there's some just background investigation that's occurring that was discussed and will be further discussed at an upcoming meeting. Additionally, it was pointed out by several, including General Counsel Snyder, that in looking back at our historical records, we do have some history of looking at these types of opportunities within RTD. Past boards and past staff leadership has looked at revenue diversification and revenue ideas, other ideas for financial resilience. And we really identified that there needs to be some work done to really look at all of those past efforts, what their results were, and where they landed. There was also a really interesting discussion around other transit agencies and how they are financed and how they may compare to us or not compare to us. And some really good, gaps in our understanding were pointed out, just in that it's hard to do an apples to apples. And as our general manager has been saying in a couple meetings recently, and I think came up yesterday, where we run the risk of being apples to fish sometimes. So the way we categorize what's state funding, for example, we had a discussion around sales tax is a form of state funding when it's done across an entire state. So when we look at the different budgets from different agencies, we have to be very intentional. So I just want to talk about some specific working action items, and one that I think is going to be something for the committee to really tune into shortly here. So some actions coming up is additional research on historical data of what we've done in the past, what's worked and what hasn't, as well as there's an opportunity in front of us to engage with the Citizen Advisory Committee to further engage some of the minds that we have around us to look at a number of ideas. Similarly, there is the Alliance to Transform Transportation that has been formed. There's an opportunity for RTD to be directly engaged at the staff level with that group. Also, and I want to highlight this, there's going to be some work done to come up with a comparable metric that really kind of looks at the percentage of state funding that agencies receive, including RTD and other agencies. Out of this will come some talking points. I think this is a really important point that I can bring back to the committee, that once we have some comparable metrics and some ways to talk about this, board members, I think, would be then encouraged to reach out to our networks and share this information openly, especially as the legislature is dialoguing about RTD. It would be good for us all to be on that same page. Additionally, there's going to be some work done investigating some additional matters, and again, looking at some of those historical recommendations. So the group is meeting again on November 6th. I do plan to attend that to again take some notes and liaise. Again, I encourage, as much as my job here is to come back and report to this committee what's happening with that working group, given that they will be providing recommendations to this committee. My job is also to take any ideas from board members and committee members back into that working group as well. So I certainly encourage my colleagues to reach out to me with any and all ideas or thoughts related to this. So with that, thank you. And also a huge thank you to all of the staff members I mentioned earlier for their involvement in this group. I think, as it was pointed out, we have repeated this effort in the past, but it's all about the intention with which we go into the effort. And this group really is working in earnest to find something material that can be done for the agency. And I certainly thank staff for using their time and expertise on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice Chair. We appreciate your operating as our liaison to the working group and creating that information base for us. Let me ask if there are any questions of Vice Chair Davidson at this time from any of the committee members or board members. Hearing none, then I will point out that our next meeting date of the Finance and Planning Committee is scheduled for Tuesday, November 14 at 5:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. And I want to congratulate all of you on being very focused and very productive over the last almost 2.5 hours. You have gone through a massive information item, 4 action items, and a long discussion item, and acquitted yourselves quite well. Director Whitmore, the interloper to the committee, you have a final observation. Your hand is up.
I do. I was quite impressed by the work of this committee, and since you're the keeper of the fife, I'd like to recommend that you're also known as the drum corps from here forward.
Thank you very much. That's an excellent way of putting it. All right. Seeing no other discussion, then let the record reflect that this meeting is adjourned as of 7:54 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. Thank you all so much